The cheap, gray fabric of the dress scratched against Brielle's skin, a constant, irritating reminder of her worth. It was the same dress she had worn for 3 days, a shapeless sack that did little to hide the generous curves of her body, the body her stepmother, Brenda, had called a burden until she found a way to make it profitable. The leather of the car seat was cold and unyielding, a stark contrast to the humid Virginia air she had been forced from. She did not know the men in the front seat. They had not spoken a word to her since they'd collected her from the curb where Brenda had left her with a single, worn suitcase and the echo of a slammed door. The car moved with a silent, expensive glide that was utterly alien. They drove for what felt like hours, finally pulling through an iron gate and up a long, winding driveway to a house that looked less like a home and more like a corporate fortress carved from steel and glass. One of the men finally spoke, his voice flat. Out. Brielle's hands trembled as she clutched the handle of her suitcase. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of calm. Crying had never helped. Brenda had taught her that lesson early. She followed the men through a cavernous entryway, her worn sneakers silent on the polished black marble. The air inside was chilled and smelled of something clean and sharp, like ozone after a storm and a faint, expensive hint of cedar. She was left in a room that could have swallowed her entire childhood home. One wall was a sheet of glass overlooking a city that glittered like a spilled box of jewels. The furniture was sparse, modern, and looked punishingly uncomfortable. There was no art on the walls, no photographs, no sign that a human being with memories or attachments actually lived here. There was only power, cold and absolute. That was when he entered. She did not see his face at first. She saw the suit. It was a charcoal gray, so dark it was almost black, tailored with a precision that seemed to defy physics. It fit his broad shoulders and narrow waist perfectly. He moved with an unnerving stillness, not a single wasted motion. He did not walk into the room. He occupied it, and the very air seemed to thin, to bend to his will. Then she saw his hands. They were resting at his sides, long-fingered and immaculate, but they held a tension, a coiled readiness that made the back of her neck prickle. He stopped several feet away from her, and for the first time, he looked at her. His eyes were a deep, dark brown, so dark they absorbed the light. They were not cruel, not angry. They were worse. They were entirely empty of emotion, the eyes of a man who calculates, assesses, and discards without a second thought. "You are Brielle," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and devoid of any discernible accent to her ear. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes. My name is Kwon Tae-jun," he stated. He gestured to a leather document case on the monolithic black desk. One of the silent men opened it. Inside, nestled on black velvet, were stacks of $100 bills. A mountain of money. "Your stepmother has been compensated," Mr. Kwon continued, his gaze never leaving hers. $1 million. A bill of sale, in essence. She was quite clear on the terms. "You belong to me now." The words hit her like a physical blow. $1 million. That was her price. The sum total of her 18 years of life, sold off by the woman who was supposed to care for her. A bitter, hot bile rose in her throat. She had known, of course. She had known Brenda was selling her, but hearing the number, seeing the casual display of cash, made it brutally, sickeningly real. What do you want from me?" she managed to ask, her voice a reedy whisper. A flicker of something, not quite surprise, maybe just mild interest, passed through his eyes. "Most women in your position would be crying by now." "It wouldn't do any good," she said, the words tasting like ash. She lifted her chin, meeting his cold, analytical stare. She was a plus-sized black girl from a dead-end town in Virginia. He was this. A king in a steel and glass castle. They were from different planets. But she would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "No. It would not. You are here to be my wife." Brielle's mind went blank. Wife. The word was absurd, a sick joke. Wife. Why? You could have any woman you want. The women I want come with attachments, ambitions, families, he said, his tone flat, as if explaining a simple business transaction. They bring complications. You, on the other hand, have no one. You are a clean slate, a convenient and, according to the contract, permanent solution to a problem I have. His problem was a rival family, the Parks, who were pushing for a marriage alliance to gain a foothold in his territory. An unmarried boss was seen as a leader without a dynasty, without a future. By marrying Brielle, a complete outsider with no connections, he was slamming the door on their ambitions and securing his position without ceding an inch of power. She was a shield, a placeholder, a piece of property acquired to fortify his empire. There will be a ceremony, a small, private affair. You will live here. You will be seen with me when required. You will not speak unless spoken to at official functions. You will not leave this building without my explicit permission and an escort. In return, you will have food, shelter, and you will not be harmed. Do you understand the terms? She felt the walls of the room closing in, the glittering city outside a beautiful, mocking prison. This was it. Her life was over. The dreams she had secretly nurtured, of community college, of becoming a pediatric nurse, of a small, quiet life far away from Brenda, all turned to dust. She was a possession, a wife in name only, a prisoner in every way that mattered. She gave a single, stiff nod. Good, he said. He turned to one of his men. Show her to her room. See that she is given something else to wear. His eyes flicked over her tattered gray dress with a flicker of distaste before his face became a blank mask once more. He turned and walked away without another word, the sound of his expensive shoes a final, damning judgment on the marble floor. Brielle stood frozen, the weight of his absolute control settling over her like a shroud. Her room was another gilded cage, larger than her old apartment, with a bathroom of marble and gold fixtures and a closet filled with clothes in her size, all bearing designer labels she'd only ever seen in magazines. The tags were still on. It was a trousseau for a doll, not a person. For a week, she saw no one but a silent housekeeper who brought her meals on a tray and tidied the room without ever meeting her eyes. She did not see him. The silence was a form of torture, a constant reminder of her complete and utter isolation. She was a ghost in a palace, her existence acknowledged only by the food that appeared and the clothes in the closet. She told herself it was survival instinct that kept her from screaming, from breaking things. It was a lie. It was despair, cold and heavy, that kept her still. Then, one evening, the silence was broken. She heard voices from the hallway, sharp and urgent. One was Mr. Kwan's, low and cutting. The other was higher, laced with panic. The Parks are moving faster than we anticipated. They hit the shipment at the docks. Losses. Kwan's voice was dangerously quiet. 3 men. And the cargo. A heavy pause. Brielle pressed her ear to the thick wood of the door. They are testing me, Kwan said, the words laced with ice. They think the failed alliance has made me weak. They are mistaken. There was a soft, metallic click, a sound she couldn't place, but which sent a shiver down her spine. Double the security. I have a gala tomorrow night. The Henderson contract. I will not show weakness by canceling. You know what to do. The voices faded. Brielle pulled back from the door, her breath catching in her chest.
Parks. Shipment.
Losses. The words were clinical, but the meaning was clear. His world, the world she was now inextricably a part of, was built on violence. The next evening, the housekeeper laid out a gown for her. It was deep sapphire silk that clung to her curves, the fabric cool and heavy against her skin. A pair of diamond earrings were placed beside it. She was being dressed up for display. When she emerged from her room, Kwan was waiting. He was in a tuxedo that made his previous suit look casual. He looked at her, his eyes doing a slow, methodical sweep from her face to the hem of the gown. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw something in his gaze, a flicker of appreciation, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cool assessment. You will stay by my side, he commanded. Do not wander off. The gala was a dizzying affair of champagne, quiet string music, and people whose smiles never reached their eyes. Brielle felt like an imposter, a child playing dress-up. She stood beside Quan, a silent accessory, as he moved through the crowd. He was a predator in his natural habitat, all quiet confidence and lethal grace. Men deferred to him, their gazes a mixture of fear and respect. Women watched him with a hungry, predatory light in their eyes, their gazes flicking to Brielle with open curiosity and disdain. She was the inexplicable variable, the strange, plus-sized black girl on the arm of the city's most dangerous man. It happened as they were standing near the terrace. A champagne flute shattered somewhere behind them. Brielle flinched at the sound, but Quan's body went rigid. It wasn't a flinch, it was a response. Before she could process what was happening, he had his hand on the small of her back, his touch like a brand through the silk, and was shoving her forward. Down, he snarled, the command a whip crack in the sudden silence. The world exploded. The polite chatter of the party was ripped apart by the sound of suppressed gunfire. People screamed. Glass from the terrace doors rained down like jagged ice. In the chaos, Quan's body was a wall of muscle and intent, covering hers, pushing her down behind a thick marble pillar. His weight was immense, pressing her into the floor, and the scent of him, cedar and something ozone-sharp, filled her senses. His breath was hot against her ear. Stay down. Do not move. The violence was choreographed and brutal. His men, who had been invisible in the crowd moments before, materialized, returning fire with a terrifying, disciplined efficiency. It was over in less than a minute. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and fear. When the silence returned, it was heavier, more profound than before. Quan shifted off her, his movements fluid. He was checking the room, his eyes scanning every corner. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight. He did not look at her. "No," she whispered, her body trembling with adrenaline. He finally turned to her, and she saw it. A dark stain was spreading on the sleeve of his white tuxedo shirt, just below the shoulder.
Blood.
"You're hit," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. His eyes narrowed. "It's a graze." He was already turning away, issuing quiet, lethal orders to his men. They spirited them out of the building through a service entrance and into a black sedan that sped into the night, leaving the chaos behind. They did not go back to the penthouse. They went to a nondescript building in a different part of the city, a safe house. It was furnished simply but comfortably, a stark contrast to the cold palace she now called home. One of his men, a grim-faced older man named Jean, brought a medical kit. "Let me see it, boss," Jean said. Quan waved him off, shrugging out of his ruined jacket. "It's nothing. See to the perimeter." As Jean left, Quan sank onto the edge of the sofa, hissing as the movement pulled at the wound. He fumbled with the buttons on his cuff, his left arm clearly in pain. Brielle watched him, her heart still hammering. This was her chance. The back door was likely unguarded. She could run, disappear into the night. She could take her chances on the street, a better fate than being a target in a rich man's war. But she looked at the blood soaking his sleeve. She looked at his face, pale under the dim light, his jaw tight with pain. And she thought of the weight of his body shielding hers. He hadn't hesitated. He had covered her without a thought for himself. It was not kindness. It was instinct. The instinct to protect one's property. Still, he had done it. She took a deep breath. "Let me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He looked up, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "I was going to study nursing," she explained quietly, stepping forward. "I know how to clean and dress a wound. You're favoring it. You'll make it worse." He watched her for a long, silent moment, his gaze unreadable. She expected him to refuse, to push her away. Instead, he gave a curt nod. She knelt before him, taking the medical kit. Her hands were shaking slightly as she took a pair of scissors and carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The wound was a long, angry gash along the meat of his shoulder. A deep graze, just as he'd said, but it was bleeding sluggishly. As she worked, cleaning the wound with antiseptic, her fingers brushed against his skin.
It was hot alive.
The muscles in his arm were coiled steel, even at rest. He was utterly still under her touch, his breathing even. She was so close she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the dark stubble shadowing his jaw. The silence in the room was thick, charged. She was intensely aware of his proximity, of the sheer physical power he radiated. As she worked, her gaze caught on a small, framed photograph on the end table beside the sofa. It was a picture of a young woman with his eyes, laughing into the camera. She looked vibrant, full of life. "She was my sister," he said, his voice low and rough. He hadn't been looking at her. He'd been looking at the photo. Her name was Minje. Brielle paused, her hands hovering over his arm. "The Parks," he continued, his voice flat but carrying a universe of pain. "It was a car bomb. Meant for my father. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was supposed to be with her. I was late. That was it." The wound he carried. Not a physical one, but a chasm of guilt and failure. He had failed to protect someone he loved, and it had cost her everything. His obsession with control, with security, with emotionless transactions, it all snapped into focus. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man haunted by one. She finished bandaging his arm, her movements gentle. Her fingers lingered for a second on the clean, white gauze. He didn't pull away. He simply watched her, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't name. It was vulnerable, raw, something he would never allow the world to see. "Brielle," he said. It was the first time he had said her name, without it sounding like a statement of ownership. It sounded different.
Softer.
Almost a question. She looked up and their eyes met. The space between them crackled with an unspoken tension. He was the man who had bought her, her jailer, a killer. But in that moment, as she knelt before him, having tended to his wound, having seen a glimpse of the man behind the mask, something shifted. The fear was still there, but it was now tangled with something else, something more complex and far more dangerous. Compassion. They returned to the penthouse the next day. The atmosphere had changed. The invisible walls between them were still there, but they were thinner now, more porous. He told her, in his clipped, direct way, that the attack at the gala meant she was now a known entity. A target. Her life, which was already not her own, was now in active danger. The gilded cage had become a fortress, and she was its most vulnerable treasure. He began spending more time at the penthouse, working from the massive black desk in the main living area instead of his downtown office. He said it was for security reasons, but it meant they were in constant, close proximity. She would read on one of the uncomfortable sofas while he conducted business in quiet, clipped phone calls. She learned the names of his lieutenants, the territories he controlled, the rhythm of his empire. She caught herself watching him. She noticed the way he would rub the bridge of his nose when he was frustrated, the way his fingers would drum a silent, complex rhythm on the desk when he was thinking. He caught her watching once. Their eyes met across the room, and a current passed between them, electric and undeniable. Neither of them acknowledged it. They just looked away, the silence stretching taut. One afternoon, she was in the kitchen, a space she'd slowly claimed as her own, trying to replicate a recipe for her grandmother's sweet potato pie from memory. One of Kwan's top men, a man named Choi, entered. He was always smiling, a trait Brielle found more unnerving than the grim silence of the others. "Smells wonderful," Choi said, his smile wide. He was on his phone. "Yes, boss. The meeting is confirmed. The usual place. Sunset," he winked at Brielle. "Making our cold boss a home, are we?" He walked out, still talking on the phone. Something about his words snagged in her mind. The usual place. She'd heard Kwan on the phone earlier that day arranging a clandestine meeting. He'd specifically said, "Not the usual place. It's too exposed. The warehouse at Pier 4". A cold dread washed over her. Choi had just lied. He had confirmed the wrong location. It was a mistake a lieutenant of his caliber would never make. Unless it wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. They were leading Kwon into an ambush. Panic seized her. She had no way to reach Kwon directly. His men were loyal to their commanders, and Choi was a commander. They wouldn't believe her. She had to do something. Her mind raced, sifting through the limited options available to a prisoner. The penthouse was a fortress, but it was in a skyscraper. A very tall, very public skyscraper. She ran from the kitchen, her heart pounding. She found what she was looking for near the service elevator, a fire alarm pull station. Her hand hovered over the lever. This was insane. It would cause mass panic, a citywide emergency response. It would put innocent people at risk. It was a chaotic, destructive, and deeply irresponsible act. It was a line she could never uncross. She thought of the raw pain in his eyes when he spoke of his sister. She thought of the weight of his body shielding her from bullets. He was a monster, but he was her monster. And they were trying to take him from her. She pulled the lever. The alarm was deafening, a shrieking klaxon that echoed through the building. Red lights flashed. A calm, automated voice instructed everyone to evacuate. It was chaos, but it was a chaos she had created. It would snarl traffic for miles. It would bring police and fire departments swarming to the area. It would make a quiet ambush at a usual place impossible. Minutes later, her door burst open. It was Kwon. He was not in a suit, but in tactical gear, a pistol strapped to his thigh. His face was a thundercloud of fury. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "What did you do?" he snarled, pulling her out into the hallway where his men were coordinating, their faces grim. "It was a trap," she gasped, trying to keep up with his long strides as he dragged her toward a private emergency stairwell.
Choi.
He lied about the location. He was sending you to an ambush. Kwon stopped dead, his eyes boring into hers. He saw the frantic truth in her expression. He spoke into the radio on his shoulder, a stream of clipped, cold commands. He was rerouting his men, changing the plan, turning the trap back on the trappers. He had believed her. Instantly. He pushed her against the wall of the stairwell, caging her in with his body. The alarm was still screaming, a soundtrack to their confrontation. "You could have gotten yourself killed," he bit out, his face inches from hers. "You could have gotten civilians killed. You would have been killed," she shot back, her fear momentarily eclipsed by her own fury. "What was I supposed to do?" He stared at her, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The anger in his eyes warred with something else, something deeper and more turbulent. "I told myself this was a contract," he said, his voice dropping to a low, raw rasp. "A simple acquisition to protect my interests. I was wrong." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. "You are a complication I did not permit." It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was a confession, an admission that she had breached his defenses, that she had become more than a placeholder, more than a shield. She had become a factor in his calculations, a variable he could not control. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Choi was a traitor, in league with the Park family. Her stunt with a fire alarm had saved Kwon's life, and in the ensuing chaos, Kwon's forces had decimated the ambush team and captured one of the Park family's key lieutenants. But the victory came at a cost. The Parks were no longer just testing him. They were at war. And now, they knew his weakness. A few days later, Kwon allowed her a small freedom, a supervised trip to a private art gallery he owned. He said she needed to be seen, to maintain the fiction of their life. She knew it was a risk, but the thought of fresh air, of a space that wasn't the penthouse, was intoxicating. She was flanked by 2 of his guards, but for an hour, she felt almost normal, losing herself in the bold colors of an abstract painting. That was when the world went sideways again. A black van screeched to a halt at the curb. Men in masks swarmed out. Her guards moved to intercept, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. One of them fell. The other shouted her name, a desperate warning, before he was overwhelmed. A hand clamped over her mouth, a cloth pressed to her face. The smell was sweet, chemical. Her last conscious thought was of Kwon's face, the fury in his eyes in the stairwell. Then everything went black. She woke to the smell of damp concrete and rust. She was tied to a chair in the middle of a vast, empty warehouse. Her head throbbed. Across from her, a man sat calmly, cleaning a long, thin knife. He was handsome in a cruel way, with the same sharp eyes as the woman in the photograph. Park Min-soo, Kwon's nemesis. The runaway bride, he said with a smirk, not looking up from his knife. My apologies for the crude accommodations, but I wanted to have a word with the woman who has so thoroughly distracted my rival. He explained, in a conversational tone, our stunt with the fire alarm had cost him dearly. He had thought she was just a piece of paper, a marriage certificate. But Kwon's reaction, the war he had waged in the last 48 hours to find her, told a different story. He values you, Park said, finally looking at her. Which makes you valuable to me. The warehouse doors burst open with a deafening crash. Light flooded the space, silhouetting a dozen figures in tactical gear. At their center was Kwon. He moved with a predatory certainty, his eyes finding hers across the space. They were locked on her, ignoring Park completely for a half-second that stretched into an eternity. It was a look of pure, undiluted possession. Park laughed, grabbing Brielle and putting the knife to her throat. One more step, Kwon, and your weakness dies. The standoff was tense, a tableau of imminent violence. But Brielle was not the same girl who had been sold for $1 million. She had been living in the heart of the storm. Her mind, sharpened by fear and proximity to danger, was racing. She had been watching, listening. She'd noticed the steady drip, drip, drip from a rusty barrel in the corner. She'd smelled the faint, acrid scent of gasoline. Near the barrel was a junction box with frayed, sparking wires. Kwon was talking, his voice calm, trying to de-escalate, to buy time. But Brielle knew Park was too unstable. He was going to kill her. She had to create an opening. Kwon, she screamed, a sound of pure terror. It was a distraction. As Park's attention flickered to Kwon for a split second, she drove her head back, hard, into his nose. There was a satisfying crunch. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She threw her entire weight forward, toppling the chair and sending them both sprawling to the ground. The knife clattered away. Gunfire erupted. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Kwon's men moved with surgical precision. While the firefight raged, Brielle scrambled away from Park, crawling on her hands and knees toward the wall. She grabbed a loose piece of metal rebar from the floor. Park, his face a mask of blood, saw her. He lunged, not for a gun, but for her. He never made it. Kwon was there, a shadow of lethal intent. He didn't use a gun. He moved past her, and the sounds that followed were brutal, final, and short.
She didn't watch.
When it was over, the silence that fell was absolute. The air was thick with smoke. Kwon came to her. He knelt, his knees cracking on the concrete. He didn't check for injuries. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. His touch was not proprietary. It was reverent. They targeted you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, because they saw what I have yet to admit. He looked directly into her eyes, and the last of his walls crumbled. You are not a part of my empire, Brielle. You are its center. The cost of that night was high. The war with the Parks was over, but the peace was paid for in blood. The last of Brielle's innocence had been stripped away in that warehouse. She had seen death, caused it, and survived it. She was no longer just a victim of this world. She was a part of it. Back in the penthouse, the city lights below seemed different. Not a mocking display, but a kingdom. Her kingdom. She was no longer wearing borrowed clothes. She wore a simple black dress of her own choosing, the silk soft against her skin. She stood at the vast window, watching the endless flow of traffic. She heard him approach, his footsteps silent on the marble. He came to stand behind her, a solid, warm presence that no longer felt like a threat. He did not touch her. He placed a single, heavy key on the glass table beside her. It was not a key to a room. It was intricate, older, the kind of key that opened the heart of a place. Choi's betrayal, it was like my father's. A brother turning on his own, he said quietly, finally giving voice to the old wound. I built this empire on the rule that I would never trust anyone again. That I would never have a weakness. I failed. She turned to look at him. His face was unguarded, his eyes holding the raw truth of his confession in the warehouse. This is your home now, Brielle, he said, his voice low and certain. If you choose it, the choice. It was the one thing she had been denied from the very beginning. Now it was being offered to her, freely and completely. The choice to stay. The choice to be the center of his violent, dangerous world. She looked from his face, to the key, then back to their reflections in the glass. A plus-sized black girl from nowhere and a Korean Mafia boss, two impossible figures silhouetted against a city they had conquered together. Her hand hovered over the key, the cold metal promising a life of peril and power. A life with him. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would take it.